Let us start this video with a question. Is education something one can just buy, get, acquire, or obtain in an institution? Ultimately, our primary goal is to discover what an educated person actually is, to find the educated man. Thus, in truth, whether the learning process takes place in an institution or out of it is of little consequence. In his 1926 book, American author Everett Dean Martin had an ideal of the liberally educated individual. What he envisioned was a mellow amateur, competent and well-informed, but all natural and human, wholly secure and at ease with his knowledge and master of his technique. But we all know that within educational circles, there is a sense of an intimidating professionalism that is rather formidable and terrifying. Of course, there is a necessity for specialized knowledge, requisite for certain learned professions, yet one can be trained professionally and still retain the spirit of the amateur, or more broadly, the spirit of the common man. One can be simultaneously brilliant and down to earth. What Martin means when he refers to professionalism is the artificial manner of one's attitude and conduct, a pompous ego, bookishness, and over-strictness in regards to petty rules, the arrogant disposition to identify education solely with the display of what is deemed conventional knowledge or dogma. Many people therefore think of education as something highbrow and elitist. In society, there are those who give the impression that education is a thing of books and schools and formalities, and that there is a recognized fraternity of finished products of this system. As apparent proof that one belongs to this fraternity, there are degrees and credits which show that the candidate has passed certain examinations and has done a required amount of reading. We have all seen people who may seek education merely because they hope it will give them a certain prestige. Martin presents an anecdote of a man who said, "I'd give $10,000 if I only knew Greek." It turns out that that man had been in the company of two elderly educated men and felt out of his depth in a conversation and humiliated because of his ignorance of the language. It never occurs to the man that if he really cared to learn Greek, he wouldn't need to pay an institution a large amount of money to teach him, and he could just buy a few textbooks and acquire that coveted knowledge in his spare time, whenever he chose to do so, and learn at his own pace. The standards and expectations of how people use their idle time and what they devote their attention to seem to have diminished greatly. The reading and study of a text in your own time would ultimately prove no more or less time-consuming than it would to learn that same text at an institution, and yet for some reason, people are reluctant to just try and teach themselves. People persist in thinking that education only comes to a man by virtue of his attendance at some place where it may be obtained. We frequently hear people say, "I had years of lessons in that subject," or "I took that course," or "I didn't do those subjects, so I don't know." This idea of formal education, which is often just book knowledge acquired in a school, this idea which we then measure, grade and standardize, may or may not be an aid to general culture. The concept of the liberal education is thus too elusive and confusing to a man who is obsessed with yardstick comparisons. However, it is important to note that a proper liberal education still has a concept of the objective. Just because one may learn and discuss ideas, concepts, or subjects in an open and unstructured manner, it does not mean that one completely loses all capacity to distinguish right from wrong. or correct from incorrect. For example, within the discipline of mathematics, 1 plus 1 is always 2. The more modernized education has become, the more divided opinions have become regarding the educational value of books, particularly tactile hard copies. Traditional education consisted almost entirely of book knowledge. Proper knowledge of the books written about a subject was rated as familiarity with the subject itself. More recently, both within and without institutions of learning, there is a tendency to merely skim over as many as possible of the latest books on a topic. This leaves little to no time for the great books, knowledge of which is essential to an authentic liberal education. Nowadays, even more so than in Martin's era, within the personal library of an up-to-date authority figure or academic on sociological or economic subjects, it would be rare to find any books written prior to the 20th century. Most modern writers all seem to desire to express the ideas and movements of the current day, sometimes to align with a politically progressive worldview, but more so to appear at the cutting edge in their field. It could be argued that a desire to be at the cutting edge presupposes an inclination toward political progressivism anyway, even if politics is not explicitly discussed. But it is difficult to see how one could ever make sound judgments on the present if there is no background in knowledge of the past. This is why we study history, so that our judgment is not impaired. Yet simultaneously, the modern utopian ideal is to live in an eternal, peaceful present, which is disconnected from the past, and therefore implies an end of history, or more precisely, an end of conflict, given that history is predominantly a study of recurring human conflicts and tensions, such as wars and revolutions. Ultimately, however, history carries on, whether we like it or not, with or without us, regardless of if that is unfortunate or otherwise. Thus, knowledge of history is important. Modern ideas of life gained from an exclusive study of the present are second-rate insofar as they lack depth. To only ever live within the moment, to imagine only one's own place and never reflect, is the fate of the fool. The Roman philosopher Cicero once said, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history?" In 1910, the American educator Professor John Erskine was a key figure in the Boarhead Society of Literature during his tenure at Columbia University. The Boarhead Society was a fringe of the Philolexian Society at Columbia. Philolexian derived from Greek philolexia, meaning love of discourse. The purpose of their society was entirely creative, reading and commenting on each other's works. Erskine formulated the General Honors Course at Columbia, which was responsible for inspiring the Great Books movement. Coincidentally, another writer who I'm familiar with, by the name of Lewis Mumford, was the original president of the Boarhead Society. Mumford himself produced a number of high-quality works, which I intend to review in future. According to Professor Erskine, education should prejudice us in favour of authors who are wise. There have not been many great men, nor many great ideas. Hence, one may acquire a liberal education from reading relatively few books. He said, the student ought to know Hobbes, he ought to know Pascal, Plato, Bacon, Homer, Spinoza, Galileo, and Da Vinci. Martin adds Erasmus, Montaigne, Hume, and Voltaire, amongst others. In truth, this is not a great deal of reading. It can be done in a leisurely manner, and this is important Our modern habit of cluttering up the mind with all sorts of second-rate, up-to-date printed matter demonstrates the busy jumpiness and hectic quality of the modern spirit, which indicates a childlike limited attention span and an inability to simply sit still. Even in 1926, Martin asserts that no one seems to take time for quiet reflection or contemplation anymore. Far too many people are too busy keeping up to date, gaining a superficial knowledge of the latest thing. And before we can pause to separate the true from the false in it, it is already out of date, and something still more modern is in fashion. There is a tendency among very modern educators to reduce book learning to a minimum. It is claimed that book knowledge is only hearsay, second-hand information. The student does not make a fact his own, so long as he must take someone else's word for it. Apparently, what books tell you prevents you from finding it out for yourself. You know an emotion only when you subjectively feel it, a fact when you subjectively deal with it, a truth when you subjectively discover it. We learn by doing and only doing. This is the doctrine of progressive practical learning. Although this rather extreme form of protest against formal book learning is really an attempt to overcorrect to the opposite extreme, to the point where no book learning is done at all, and nobody reads anything so as to experience everything. But then again, immersive reading itself is also an experience. That being said, we all know people who are conventionally educated, who go too far and substitute reading for living, and the book for reality. There are those who never talk about events or ideas, but always quote what some book says about them, as if they believe that subjects are only worthy of contemplation if they are presented in print. The world of actions and things gives way to the world of words only. Education becomes an evasion of the challenge of real situations. Emotion and fancy are exhausted in doing nothing. It becomes more preferable to read about things than to experience them. The individual thinks he has acquired wisdom, when all he really has is a taste for reading and a good memory. Perhaps the best illustration of the author's point can be found in a classic scene of the animated series The Simpsons. The author's point is about the standards of education now descending to the point where you have conventionally educated hyper-intellectuals who substitute books for reality and reading for living, juxtaposed against practical learners who live and experience life but lack the depth of the educated. The Simpsons episode in question is when Martin Prince and Bart Simpson become friends and teach each other their ways. It is a perfect archetypal explanation of both characteristics. Martin is too bookish and needs to loosen up. Bart is too loose and needs to be educated. Martin then reaches what he deems to be the zenith and feels most alive with adrenaline after he acts with a newfound reckless abandonment and participates in a prank, to then briefly become more rebellious before returning to a more balanced state. Traditionally, the typical person was more like Martin Prince, whilst nowadays the typical modern person is more like Bart Simpson, and is now arguably too much like him, doing only as they feel and listening too much to their inner child. As the author rightly asserts, the platitude that one can learn more out of life than out of books is a saying which just flatters the illiterate. It is a thoroughly modern view to believe that the best way to get an education is to stop studying and just live life, whatever that means, since what it means to live life is subjective. As per usual on this channel, it appears that Aristotelian virtue, or the golden mean between deficiency and excess, is the ideal point of moderation. However, both the author and I alike are of the opinion that anyone who can learn from life can also learn from books without spoiling his mind. There is a difference between learning from books and merely learning to repeat passages from them. Yet it could also be argued that when one really learns from books, one really learns from life in a way as well, given that books are just the experiences of life in recorded form. Whether or not one can gain more from a book or more from life experience often depends on three things. 1, the quality of the book. 2, what one wishes to learn about. And 3, the individual's capacity to learn. Merely doing something has no more educational value than merely repeating words. Either can become a routine exercise. Martin asserts that education is the organization of knowledge into human excellence. It is not the mere possession of knowledge, but the ability to reflect upon it and grow in wisdom. The individual who is part of the multitude or the masses prefers radio and television to reading and finds the tales of classic literature tedious except when they are presented in the movies. He reads history and science only in brief outlines. As a result, he is probably correct that books cannot teach him much. Why read something when you can watch it, especially if you don't even know where to start the journey of reading? The person who possesses a liberal education has worked to develop the habit of reading good books, the ability to know good books from inferior ones, and the capacity to enjoy books for the beauty and wisdom that may be found in them. A school that implants good habits of sensible, discriminating reading in its students is a good school. One that fails to do so is a bad school. The modern education system has merely taught the public to read, but has hardly taught them that which is worth reading. As such, the public mostly reads trash. Modern education is in one way official and professionalized, but in another it is superficial and illiberal. Lots of people say that their elementary, secondary, or tertiary education is of little use to them in their later years. It is something they do not keep up and leave behind as soon as they exit the institution. They think that any education and cultural achievement which doesn't have obvious practical application belongs within the bounds of the school. Most of the advancement in scholarship is just work that is left to professional academics as members of university faculties. Outside the institutions of learning, there is very little independent creative thought. As an example, nowadays, the typical person finds it odd or quaint for someone who is not formally trained or training in art or creative writing to be intensely passionate about painting or poetry. The prevailing view is somewhat dismissive. If you're not professional and can't make money from it, why would you bother? Nowadays, there are almost no men of leisure who actively engage with the niche of culture and carry on the progress of civilization as a chosen way of life, living as self-taught educated amateurs or autodidacts, aside from perhaps people like me, you, and a few of our friends. To give insight into the modern utility of the subject of philosophy, most will only learn it so that they may become philosophy specialists and can teach it to others as a profession, when in fact, the true value of philosophy is almost immeasurable. Ancient scholars and learned figures alike would surely agree that philosophy is, or ought to be, part of the foundational structure of any proper education, as both it and theology allow us to ponder necessary questions crucial to the understanding of what it means to be human. Traditionally, philosophy has 5 branches: metaphysics, relating to ontology, the study of the state of being; logic, the study of reasoning; ethics, relating to axiology, the study of what one ought to do or what is right; aesthetics, the study of beauty and art; and epistemology, the study of knowledge and the scope of knowledge, or what we know and what is known. In the end, if no one outside of professional academics engages in scholarship, scholarship eventually dies. Hence, the seeds of education do not take root if nobody chooses to plant them. Far too many people believe that culture and education are the special functions of the professional educator or gardener, and thus they never plant seeds themselves in their own gardens, despite being perfectly capable of doing so if they wish. There would even be many professional educators or gardeners who would be no doubt astonished or even jealous if they saw well-kept trees of knowledge growing outside of the walls of their institutions. If you are to become educated, whoever you are, you must not be content to let it be a public affair at the mercy of schools and universities. You must make it your own private affair. Make it your business to tend to your own intellectual, cultural, and educational garden, and make your garden as vibrant and beautiful as can be. Martin concludes the chapter by stating that the ignorance and folly of men are things that institutions cannot cure. Each man must discover the path of wisdom for himself. One does not get an education anywhere. It is not necessarily a thing in itself, but one becomes educated by virtue of patient study, quiet meditation, intellectual courage, and a life devoted to the discovery and service of truth. Such is my passion for the topics I discuss that I've started a Patreon and now most recently an Odyssey channel, because I know that passion won't fade. So if you enjoyed the video or find my analysis and insight valuable, please consider liking the videos, subscribing to the channel, or showing some support, and join the discussions of upcoming video essay topics and future book reviews. Your recommendations would be welcome. I will eventually post channel updates regularly on there, and will give you some insight into the next books or ideas that will be used for content. I also plan to eventually create a Rumble and Subscribestar account, so come back to the channel and keep your eyes open for that. Follow the links in the video description below or on the channel About page under links. Thank you very much for the feedback and support you've shown thus far.